It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Michelle Malyn. Michelle is from the Sebastian Inlet District, and we first met back in the spring when I had decided I would start cleaning out my file cabinet. And I knew that they were having their 100th anniversary celebration this year, and so I had a file called Sebastian Inlet. So I took it in and shared it with Michelle, and she took pictures of it, and I also had a photograph, an aerial photograph of when they reopened the inlet after the war. And so since then, Michelle and I have been speaking, and so I invited her to come and share the history of Sebastian Inlet with you today. So here is Michelle Malyn.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. How are you today? Good. First things first, I want you all to know that we really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share some of this stuff with you. We did kind of an abbreviated version of our 100 years, oh my goodness, back in early May. But this is the first time that anyone's going to see the extended presentation that we put together, leveraging some of the district's archives. And you know, Barbara mentioned she came by with a file folder, and it was just a treasure trove of stuff, and I was knee deep into looking through all the historical archives that we had, and it just excited me so. So a lot of the stuff that we have to share here with you today is just, it's never been seen before. They've been sitting in boxes in storage, and as far as I can tell, the comprehensive story of how the Sebastian Inlet came to be and what the district's role in that, it hasn't been told. So without further ado, Barbara referenced that I am with the Sebastian Inlet District, was hired a little over a year ago as their Public Information Associate. The administrator, who has since retired, Marty Smithson, a lot of people locally know Marty. He'd been doing that for about 14 years, and he saw an opportunity really to pull all of these archives together, digitize them, and get ready to share our 100-year story with the community. So that was the cool project that I got to work on right away. I got to look through all the old photos and go through all the old minutes and digitize everything, and so it was just really a lot of fun. And then we developed what we're calling our centennial celebration that we officially kicked off on May 23rd of this year. It's 52 weeks of lots of different things, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. We also produced a historical video in partnership with the Indian River County Historical Society and Ruth Stanbridge. They brought some resources to us in the form of a video producer that was interested in helping us, and so I'll share that with you here today too. But before we do, I thought I would go into just a quick overview of who we are. So the Sebastian Inlet is one of 60 inlets on the east coast of Florida. You all know that we're situated between Brevard and Indian River counties. The inlet is bordered on both sides by Sebastian Inlet State Park, and they, on average, rank anywhere between 750,000 and 1 million visitors every year. A recent article in the paper just highlighted their revenue for the last fiscal year from July 18 to June 19, $1.8 million in revenue brought in by Sebastian Inlet State Park that supports, in part, our area. So you can see that's where we are. I think everybody in this room knows that. So the Sebastian Inlet District was created in 1919 as an independent special district by a special act of the Florida State Legislature. And again, it's just important to point out that distinction between who we are and what we do and the Sebastian Inlet State Park. They are actually two separate entities. The Sebastian Inlet State Park is managed under the auspices of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and we are actually governed by a 5-member elected commission. Our boundaries run north, encompassing portions of Brevard County, and south into Indian River County, again encompassing just a portion of Indian River County. We do have 3 Brevard County seats, 2 Indian River County seats, for a total commission of 5 4-year terms for those folks. But these are the folks that really direct and guide the Sebastian Inlet District's navigation channel maintenance, if you will. One of the other things I like to share that I learned that people don't necessarily know is the state of Florida has a Beach Management Act, and the Sebastian Inlet District is mandated to bypass sand that ultimately migrates into the inlet system back into the downdrift system. Our commission has really actively chosen to engage in beach renourishment projects to the south rather than just dumping that sand offshore, which is typical bypassing. The reason for that is that we have some really important, as you guys know, habitat. That nearshore hard bottom reef to the south of the inlet, we'll talk about a little bit, is just home to a variety of different species, fish, turtles depend on it. So we know that it's important that we actually not just bypass sand, that we take it a step further than our charter requires. So we talked a little bit about this. Sebastian Inlet supports a rich and diverse ecological environment. We know that the seagrass beds to the west on the flood shoal are really important. And we've seen a resurgence of Johnson's seagrass, which is still a threatened species, though the biologists tell me it not necessarily should be anymore. But we see that now on all 6 shoals out there. And we know how important seagrass beds are. Everybody here does. We talked about that nearshore hard bottom reef. Just as something that I thought was interesting in terms of point of fact, I did not know that juvenile endangered green sea turtles can spend up to the first 2 years of their lives grazing in that important habitat, just for starters. We also know that we sit between 2 segments of Archie Carr, and everybody here again is well familiar with the fact of our sea turtle nesting densities that we have on our beaches here in Brevard and Indian River counties. So bottom line is we know it's important to conduct our work in a very environmentally responsible way because of all of those critical habitat that are around the inlet. So, next slide. You know that Sebastian Inlet is known as a premier fishing, boating, surfing, recreational area on the east coast of Florida. This doesn't come as a surprise to any of you. Again, you know Sebastian Inlet. Enough about that. Let's take a look at the video. And actually, before we play this, I have to credit Jim Culberson. He's the first person that you'll see featured in this video, but none of this would be possible without him. He spent years researching, interviewing people, pulling together these historical archives that now live with the district. So I just got to come in and kind of build on what he initially started. Play the video in a different player because it's just better.
Now, the history of the Sebastian Inlet is long and complex. The history of the inlet today, as we know it, traces back to one man. Most likely just about the very first settler in this area. His name was David Peter Gibson. He came down here first in 1859. The highway was that lagoon. There was no I-95. There were no roads. There were no overland trails. To get here, you had to come by boat. As for substantiated attempts to open the Sebastian Inlet here, they really began in earnest in, well, 1872. Things began to really get serious in 1905. There was an organization that mounted an effort and actually opened the inlet. Water flowed through the inlet for 2 weeks. Royden Orestesso Couch, more than any other human being, was responsible for getting this inlet open. And when he arrived in 1905, he probably witnessed this effort being made to open the inlet and became interested. He was the kind of guy that couldn't take no for an answer. In 1914, he tried but could not get funding for it at that time. And the Hewlett Rhodes Bill in 1917 was an effort to make it possible for a taxing district to be created. When the vote was taken here in the county, the north end of the county voted against it, and the south end of the county voted for it, and so it didn't happen. Roy Couch continued to lobby for any kind of governmental aid he could. So on May 23rd, 1919, the Sebastian Inlet District came into being. And with that, it was all systems go. Roy Couch had the 6-inch suction dredge ready to go. He got
and to open that inlet in a very dramatic way. So once it was opened, it has been maintained since that time until today. By the 50s, they had come up with some very unique and important improvements to the district. The widening and the deepening of the inlet, extending the jetties both north and south. In February of 1965, a new bridge was opened over the inlet connecting Brevard County and Indian River County. During the 70s, the state of Florida decided that this Sebastian Inlet area was the perfect place for a state park.
In the mid-1980s, there was a vacancy on the Sebastian Inlet Tax District Commission, and some folks came to me and asked me if I would consider an appointment for then Governor Bob Martinez. The very first vote that I cast was for the first long-range planning document to be assembled for any inlet around the state of Florida. We needed someone to follow through and execute the long-range management plan. We hired an executive director. We also exercised our influence in maximizing and leveraging grants that were available. When we got into that area, we really started bringing in the higher education and the scientific institutions, but we put it all together and became, in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, really without a doubt the gold standard in the state of Florida, and that's where much of the success that you see today, that's when much of it started. Building a brand new north jetty that was completely eroded and it was a safety hazard, allowed to build offices and infrastructure, water, picnic pavilions out on Sandpoint, rock revetments that were on line each side of the inlet, continued planning for navigational markers on the interior of the floodshell area, and probably the fishing museum and the offices for the park were one of the larger items that we were done, but we enjoy the spoils of all that hard work today. My great-grandfather, whom I was named after, he was the first one here. But chances like that usually come once in a lifetime, and I wasn't going to let it get by.
Well, I started in 2004. It started with a bang because right after I started, I think about 3 days later was Hurricane Jean, and then Francis followed right after. Then we had a new commission that started right immediately following the storms. The new commission in 2004 took on a stance for fiscal responsibility. And so over about a 3-year period, we reduced our tax rate by 68%. They also believed in cost share with other agencies. In the state of Florida, DEP cost shared with our projects. I think in 10 years, we brought in over $8 million of cost share. Also, Florida Inland Navigation District, working with them. They helped us with some funding on our channel work and anything that's navigation related. The opening of Sebastian Inlet over the last 100 years has created massive flood shoals from the sand, and so this is prime habitat for seagrass. 240 acres of lush seagrass beds. These beds have been damaged by boaters that zigzag back and forth trying to find their way into the inlet. When we completed our navigation channel, marked the channel, this directed the boaters without crossing the grass beds, without creating prop scars and dredging up the sensitive seagrass. All in all, our economic analysis showed that this inlet is worth about $200 million a year to the local region. We actually deepened and expanded our sand trap, which is a 42-acre depression in the middle of the inlet. About every 4 years, it collects 200,000 cubic yards of sand. By state law, we have to take that sand and then transport it, bypass it to the south to make up for any coastal erosion. Today, I would say that we're a very sophisticated inlet because of the approach to science and management. We are the most data-rich inlet, not only in the state of Florida, but I believe on the east coast of the United States. The Sebastian Inlet is a premier surfing, boating, fishing, sightseeing destination. There's people that come from all over the world to visit this area.
So that's the first thing, that's one of the first things we actually put together was that video. We brought Jim Culberson back into the community. He's living in the Panhandle now, and we said who better to tell the story but to put Jim on camera and let him be the first person to kind of open this. But now we kind of get to dig into the rest of the history. And just a note, in this particular picture, we are told that the man standing in the water here was Charlie Sembler. That is the great-grandfather of the Charlie Sembler that you saw in the video, which I just thought was really neat. So while the district was created on May 23rd, 1919, we actually have to go back a lot further, as you heard in the video, to tell the story of the Sebastian Inlet. We know that the first settlers began to arrive in the Sebastian River area in the mid-1800s, and by all accounts, there were numerous attempts to open a cut or an inlet along the barrier island, connecting the Indian River Lagoon, the river at the time, to the Atlantic Ocean, and close to what is present-day Sebastian Inlet. For many years, it was believed that Reverend Thomas New was the first to attempt a cut. But in his work, Jim Culberson, working with Fred Hopwood and others, were able to put together different pieces of material evidence, this among them, to prove that D.P. Gibson was actually the first man to attempt a cut over on the barrier island. And this is actually a U.S. geodetic map that's in our archives from 1880-81. You can see Gibson's cut noted on this map over here, and his homestead, we know, was right here on the tip of the Sebastian Creek. So when we dug into D.P. Gibson, he was really a very colorful character. Historians believe that he and his brother came down in the late 1850s. Historians believe that the date of that first attempt to dig a cut by D.P. Gibson was 1972. 1872, excuse me, which is just, not 19.
We're paying attention.
Yay! You guys get gold stars. I love it. I love it. So D.P. Gibson, by all accounts, was kind of a character. He was known for unscrupulous land deals, selling land he didn't really own. He had numerous wives, and he just kind of disappeared. No one really knows whatever happened to D.P. Gibson, so there's a lot of stories and mystery surrounding that. What we do know is that he came down to Florida with his brother. He went back to Georgia. We've been able to substantiate this, to fight for the Confederacy in the Civil War. And then after he was accused of murder, after the war ended, he hightailed it back down to this area and then started working in the Sebastian River area and attempting a cut. Also in our archives, this is a copy of the 1885 census of the city of Sebastian. It lists the whole document lists 6 heads of household with 23 adults and 16 children as residents of the small town. The very first name is D.P. Gibson. So we do know that by 1905, there were 6 substantiated attempts to open a cut or an inlet, and almost all were closed by sand, storms, or other natural causes as soon as they were opened. In 1905, Roy O. Couch, a man who, his name will become synonymous with Sebastian Inlet, came to the area. His arrival coincided with that 6th attempt to open an inlet in 1905. And though we found newspaper articles that report that they were successful in opening a cut, it wasn't long before it again closed. Just a little on Roy O. Couch, pictured here. He came to Mico, Florida to manage a family grove that he and his sister had inherited. He was born in October 1878 in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. No other man, at least from what we've been able to find, persevered the way that Roy Couch did over a number of years to get a permanent inlet open at Sebastian Inlet. And so it deserves a lot of credit for that. The other thing that I thought was really neat, we've also got a large format historical collection and archive. This is actually dated September 1905 from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Jacksonville, Florida. And it actually identifies, again, Gibson's Cut as a local feature that was there when they came to survey the area. From 1909 to 1914, I know that's a big span, but we know that the water quality in the Indian River Lagoon was steadily declining. By 1914, Couch was able to help organize a petition, and 40 individuals spoke at the April 1914 Brevard County Commission meeting. They asked for $1,200 towards opening an inlet, but it didn't go anywhere. The following year, in 1915, Couch was lobbying state representatives in Tallahassee, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Jacksonville and in Washington. They wouldn't issue the needed War Department permits for them to dig an inlet. Why? We know that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers were obliged to maintain the East Coast Canal, and they did not want to incur the additional expense of dredging sand shoals that would form if an inlet was opened. The United States Army Corps of Engineers insisted that for approval, a local tax district would have to be formed, and that's the first time that a local taxing district ever kind of came into play. So then we look at 1916 and 17 as World War I was going on. Several things aligned in Roy Couch's favor. So we know that a friend and sympathetic ear, a Dr. William Leland Huglet, was elected to the state senate. And Couch succeeded in getting a bill on November's ballot that called for a special election so Brevard County voters could decide whether to form a special district and allocate monies toward the opening of an inlet. The Huglet Roads bill was defeated. The majority of northern Brevard County residents were against it. So again, after all of Roy Couch's efforts, it didn't lead anywhere. In the following year, April 25th, 1918, the Sebastian Inlet Association was formed. Now, the association predated the district, and really what it was a collective of locals who believed that a Sebastian Inlet should be open. In fact, Couch was able to get a permit issued to allow them to dig an inlet, but it was a conditional permit. So it called for the association to be responsible for removing those sand shoals that they knew would form, releasing the Army Corps of Engineers from that responsibility. They needed to post a $10,000 bond, and they gave them a very short time frame to complete the work with a permit expiration date of December 31st, 1918. Unthinkably short period of time, but they did it. So that was the 7th attempt to open an inlet. So Roy Couch, again, still involved, got straight to work. He built the 6-inch suction dredge, hired that Charlie Sembler, the original, to dredge the cut. This is actually a photo from 1918 showing the last plug of land before they were able to get it open in that unthinkably short period of time. But here is where we come across another kind of interesting tale. So a historian who interviewed the son of a man who was part of what was dubbed a destruction crew. Organized by influential area residents, they were opposed to the inlet to protect their citrus grove, cattle farm interests. We know that the A.B. Michaels family had groves on the barrier island. A lot of folks were fearful that the salt water would compromise their wells. Whether the tale is true, I haven't been able to substantiate it in any other way. But again, this was told to Jim, and so I trust that this gentleman heard it. We know that the inlet again closed after they got it open in late 1918. Now, that didn't stop them. Couch and the Inlet Association went back to work. The permit date expiration came and went. All of the association's board members were officially threatened with arrest if work didn't stop, but they kept going. Couch and several other influential citizens went to Washington, D.C. then to meet with Senator Duncan Fletcher to lobby for his support for a new permit from the War Department. He went to Tallahassee when he got back. The special district's boundaries, that bill that had been defeated in 1917, they crafted a new version, and they redrew the boundaries to exclude the northern Brevard County residents that were against it. And so finally the bill passed, and on May 23rd, 1919 is when the Sebastian Inlet District was formed, with the charter of maintaining that navigable channel that connects the lagoon and the Atlantic Ocean. So here, again, included in our archives, this is the Bureau Press from September 1919. It's got an article in it that talks about celebrating the victory of Sebastian Inlet with a local fish fry. This photo here actually came to us from the Indian River County Historical Society archives. It's from January 1919. Just some locals going down to check on the progress of opening the inlet. So on August 31st, 1920, the district was granted a permit to dig the inlet that would remain valid until 1923. And the inlet was once again open in June of 1923. So shown here, you've got 2 barges of coquina rock that were used to build the first jetties down at the inlet. And over here on the left is the Model T Ford that was converted by Roy O. Couch to haul lumber and also those coquina rock back and forth in their work. The driver in this case is identified as Rodney Craigle, son of Paul Craigle, who we know is an early pioneer settler of Sebastian and the first manager of Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. So then we look into the 30s. The Great Depression obviously started in October 1929 and persisted for a decade. The inlet became, we know, even more vital to the area's survival. Subsistence fishing put food on the table for many local families. Commercial fishing was really the lifeblood of towns like Sebastian and Grant. Railroads helped transport fish to northern markets, and the advent of ice plants helped keep things refrigerated and reduce fishermen's loss and stabilize price. So shown here is, whoops, this is a Bob Kempfer photo, and you guys may know the name Bob Kempfer, of a massive tarpon caught in the early 1930s. And then this is an aerial showing those fishing shanties that had popped up on the southern banks that Ruth referenced in the video. We know that the inlet was also a popular recreational area in the 1930s. We've got photos that are included in the district's archives to the left that you also saw in the video. It was the destruction at the inlet from the 1933 floor report from the War Department for assisting in opening the now shoaled-in inlet. And they referenced affidavits that they brought with them to Washington from 3 commercial fishing operations in the Sebastian area, just as proof of how important it was to the local region and the local economy. So they were able to convince the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to help them open an inlet. In 1939, the U.S. Army Corps contributed $1,000 towards the operation of its dredge named the U.S. Congaree, and the Sebastian Inlet District contributed $5,000. So for a total of $6,000, they removed approximately 61,000 cubic yards. So we came across the actual plans from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the War Department for that dredging project by the U.S. Dredge Congaree, and we do have a full copy of the testimony that was given to the War Department asking for help in opening the shoaled-in inlet. And just going through this stuff again and being able to share this stuff is, I think, really exciting. I've referenced that we have a large format collection. So after the U.S. Dredge Congaree did their work, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers went back to complete a bathymetric survey of the inlet. So this is the inlet open now in April of 1940 as surveyed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I know you can't see it, but it is a beautifully detailed, hand-drawn bathymetric survey of the entire inlet system that is about this big in real life. And we're very fortunate to have all of these things on file. So we know that in 1941, the inlet was closed again by a strong nor'easter. December 7th, 1941 was, of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and it led the United States to enter World War II. You heard in the video that the decision was made to keep the inlet closed for safety reasons. The use of lights of any kind on our beaches were, of course, illegal because of the scare posed by German U-boats off of our coast. We had citizen spotter towers along the coast. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. The Indian River County Historical Society online has a World War II video that they produced, and there's actually a gentleman featured in that video who was 15 at the time. His father was one of these citizen spotters, and so he recounts the story of going out to these spotting towers during World War II with his father to man for German U-boats off our coast. It's a great video. I would highly recommend going to see it if you're interested in that kind of stuff, which of course you are. So this is a picture of the tower from 1944 with a 14 high foot sand dune in the middle of Sebastian Inlet. And then one of the things that I also just thought was really interesting. We're able to match and connect the tower to those large format surveys. You can't read it, but in this little red circle here, it says tower, and that's the tower that they're talking about. So again, we just wanted to share. Go back? Oh, okay. We also know that during the war, the inlet site was turned over to the U.S. Navy as an amphibious training ground for their demolition squads. I think Ruth talked a little bit about that in the video. We know that post-war, Roy Couch went back to the War Department, and just a quote out of an excerpt out of that War Department testimony, he had been informed that the training received by these squads was an inestimable value to the war effort, as the character and the terrain at Sebastian Inlet closely duplicated that of the South Pacific. So we know that after the war, there were a lot of temporary openings, none lasted long. This aerial is another cool thing from our archives. This is an aerial taken on March 7th, 1945. You can see where the inlet was, but there's no connection over on the beach to the Atlantic Ocean. So we know that they got serious again in 1947. And these three gentlemen pictured here were really at the heart of the effort. This is Roy O'Couch. He's still around from 1905 to 1947, still working at it. Jake Brannon, and this is Harry Good Sr., who comes into play and also becomes a really strong advocate for my understanding of the inlet and serves as a commissioner and a leader. So in 1947, they start doing a lot of work, and we've got a ton of photos from this time, and just amazed that we have as many as we do. So this kind of shows that them shaping the final line of sand, and some gentlemen watching some bulldozers work there. We know that in 1948, and using some of that surplus U.S. Navy demolitions left behind from their training at the inlet site during World War II, those three gentlemen, Roy Couch, Harry Good Sr., Jake Brannon, they blasted the inlet open with dynamite, and since that time, the inlet has been open. It's been permanently open since 1948. And this is Roy O'Couch again, hard at work, still in 1948. So this is one of my favorite stories that we came across associated with the opening in 1948. So this is an official letter that accompanied this expense report from Jake Brannon. And if you may not be able to read the circles from where you sit, but 4 drinks and entertainment, 5 dinners, drinks and entertainment, 2 dinners, drinks, bourbon, 3 whiskeys, 4 bourbons, 2 bottles of bourbon, and then right here in blue, it confirms that these were the guys that were actually hauling the dynamite. So I'm not sure that's a great combination, all that alcohol and dynamite, but they survived and they got the inlet open for us. So we know that in the 1950s there were a number of projects completed at the inlet. A total of 4 maintenance dredging projects were completed to deepen and widen the inlet. They removed a total of 355,000 cubic yards of sediment from the inlet, sediment or sand. We also know that new concrete construction extended both the north and the south jetties 200 feet and 175 feet respectively. And these are just some of the photos from that work. Then we look at the 1960s. There's the Inlet District did a channel dredging project in 1962, and the inlet sand trap was first excavated to capture sand that would otherwise cause shoaling. Later you'll see where the sand trap is located within the inlet system, but today it is actually a 42-acre depression that collects sand that is periodically dredged, and then we move that sand back into the system. One of the most significant events that happened in the 1960s, on February 27th, 1965, the bridge that crosses over, and you'll remember this, right? The bridge that, you may be too young to remember it, but you remember it, good. The bridge that crosses over Sebastian Inlet was opened. And in return for helping complete the bridge and pave A1A, Brevard County actually ceded 3 miles of land south of the inlet to Indian River County. You'll see that this is a full-page spread that was in the Vero Beach Press Journal announcing the bridge dedication. We know that more than 6,000 people attended the ceremony, where Senator Merrill P. Barber served as Master of Ceremonies. If you look really close, down here in the corner, you'll see a shadow of 2 planes, which when I found that, I was just blown away. We know that the Florida National Guard from Jacksonville sent in 2 fighter jets to participate in that opening day ceremony, and whoever took this photo, I'm not sure, they caught it, which I thought was just, again, amazing. In 1966, this is a high altitude aerial that just kind of shows the bridge looking south on the left, and then of course looking north on the right. In 1968-69, work begins on another major project, which was the complete overhaul of both the north and south jetties. They did a 500-foot extension of the north jetty to incorporate that crib structure that is seen present day, and that, again, immediately they followed that project up with extension and a concrete cap for the south jetty. That work would extend into 1970, and we just have a slew of, it's unfortunate they're a little water damaged, but we've got a slew of photos from that work that included in a book that we're going to be sharing with everybody in a month or two. We were talking about Jack Fort, and I know what I know, but I know there's also stuff that I don't know, so I'll ask you to fill in some gaps. We do know that Jack Fort's Crow's Nest was a well-known fish camp located by the North Jetty. We know that it was an institution at Sebastian Inlet for many, many years. We know that Fort would become an outspoken advocate for local fishermen in a clash that really erupted as an unintended consequence of that 68, 69, early 70 jetty extension. The jetty extension created what was dubbed First Peak. Some would argue was the best wave on the east coast of Florida, and in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, it produced world-class champion surfers that went on to surf with the World Surf League. People like Matt Keckley, and folks know the name Kelly Slater. So flashback to 1970. For months, we know that fishermen clashed. We know that they signed a peace pact that was detailed in the Florida Today in April of 1970. But in reality, we also know that that feud continued for many years to come. But again, this is Jack Fort. Barbara helped me ID Jack Fort. And this you can see, just the proximity of our anglers and our surfers sometimes kind of getting in the way of one another. So just 4 days after the fishermen and surfers signed that supposed peace pact in April 1970, Fort hosted a breakfast party for the final inspection of the North Jetty. And among those pictured here, you can see is Harry C. Good, Sr. He, again, one of those people that blasted the inlet open back in 1948. Later that same month, April 19th and 20th of 1970, the navigation light is installed at the tip of the North Jetty, and the following day, the final inspection to the South Jetty take place. These are all of our commissioners for the district at the time that were there, John Mays, Lisbon Futch, and Harry C. Good Sr. Also in the 1970s, another event of major importance that, again, would forever change the landscape of what is Sebastian Inlet is the state of Florida acquires the land surrounding the inlet. And in 1971, they established the state park. I talked a little bit about it at the front. It is one of the most visited parks across the entire state, and visitors from all over the globe know Sebastian Inlet. So this is hard to see, but it's a really cool thing that we have in our archives. In 1972, that area known as the Sand Trap, which is located right here within the inlet. You can see the system. Here's the North Jetty, South Jetty, inlet. Here's the Sand Trap. So in 1972, the Sand Trap is deepened and they've dredged the sand. 420,000 cubic yards of sand were placed on downdrift beaches to counter erosion. The Sand Trap at this point was expanded to be 32 acres. The entire project cost almost $200,000, which I thought was kind of a pittance. The other thing that was really neat that I came across was actually the bid tabulation sheet. So this shows all of the vendors that bid on this particular project to widen and deepen and excavate the sand trap, and what they came in at in terms of their bids. So in 1982, after decades of governance by a 3-member commission, there was a Florida Senate bill that was passed to add 2 seats to the commission. So later that year, 2 new commissioners were sworn in for the district. What we understand is that there were some tumultuous times in the early mid-'80s for the district. There were some disputes with the state agency that was responsible for the state park at the time. That was the Department of Natural Resources. There were some disputes over easements and expansion plans for the park. And you heard Charlie talk about that a little bit in the video. By, I think it was 1987, you had an almost entirely new commission that was set. And it was really, I think, a pivotal time. They worked really hard to mend some of those strained relationships. And from what we understand, they drafted the state's first inlet management plan. They hired an official executive director and administrator. They really began to forge partnerships with higher education, and they really tried to turn things around. We know that in 1988, the district competed for a portion of $1 million in state funds that was available for sand transfer and was awarded $776,000. So we know that things had kind of shifted back by the late 80s, and things were on good terms again with those state agencies that, unfortunately, in the early 80s, relationships were a little more tenuous. We also know that for its work in turning around kind of the district, in 1989, district leadership received the local government award from the Florida Shore and Beach Preservation Association for leadership in developing the Sebastian Inlet Comprehensive Management Plan, which serves as a model program for inlet management for the rest of the state. So I talked a little bit about 1990s is where we really see the shift to science and partnerships with higher education to do not only physical but biological monitoring of the important habitats around the inlet. Virginia Polytechnic did a 2-year study on sea turtle nesting and hatchling success in the area. They studied the reefs, the seagrass beds, fisheries, you name it. And there were a lot of other institutions that we partnered with at that time beyond those that are on this slide. Also in the 1990s, that outreach to academia and the focus on science, that was really in addition to all of the technical and engineering things that the district had to do to maintain the jetties and the management of the inlet system, the bypassing of sand, etc. I just thought this was kind of a unique photo. This was a major dredge project that occurred in 1990, and you can see all of the equipment that was brought into the inlet to do that bypassing work. So in 1993, the wave gauge, you see the submerged wave gauge out here. It's very technical. It's an acoustic Doppler profiler, which I had no idea what that meant. So I asked Gary, Gary, what does that mean? He said, okay, well, you've got 4 sensor heads, and it measures water pressure, it measures elevation and velocity to determine the current speed and direction, and it feeds into all this complex modeling work that we do for you guys. I'm like, okay, all right, great. We're gonna have to talk a little more about that, but in addition to that submerged wave and weather gauge that's been out there since 1993, still there, transmits data to a data logger over here on the shore every 15 minutes. So think about all that data that we have on hand about the wave energy and the way that currents and systems work around the inlet, going all the way back to 1993. And in 1995, they put a meteorological station over on the tip of the North Jetty, which again also feeds into the modeling work that's done by Dr. Zerillo. He is one of the world's, he doesn't like it when I say it, but he's one of the world's leading coastal modeling scientists, and we're very fortunate to have him here in our backyard. We're also very fortunate that he has seen fit to partner with the district for decades to do the important work that he's done with us and share that more broadly. But I would tell you that, you know, the reason that we work with Dr. Zerillo is to effectively manage sand resources within the area and within the inlet system. There is no other inlet system in Florida, and perhaps along the entire east coast of Florida, that has the level of the amount of data that we have for the systems that work in that area. This is a 1998 aerial of the inlet, and I just put it in there because I think they're great. I love these shots. What it does show, you can see some of the development at Sebastian Inlet State Park that Charlie talked about in the video that occurred over the 1990s. They had a whole bunch of improvements. They added picnic pavilions to Coconut Point. They put up the fishing museum. They upgraded boat ramps for better access. They refurbished buildings and structures. They installed potable water systems and later modernized the jetties. So there's just a lot of work that happened. After Charlie served as a district commissioner, he then went on to serve as a state rep. And he was really responsible in Tallahassee for kind of raising the flag for the Sebastian Inlet and the Sebastian Inlet State Park and the many improvements that they wanted to do down there. So 1999, that was just some images that show you kind of what our sand bypass, beach renourishment projects look like. Starting with, the dredge that is positioned over that sand trap area with feeder pipe that goes down to the beach where sand is then filtered out and then shaped by bulldozers. It's not just arbitrarily shaped either, which, again, until I worked with the district, I didn't really understand all of the ins and outs. But there are coastal engineers that design beach fill templates. There's actually complex engineering and science behind the placement of this sand on those beach fronts. And again, we're mandated by the state of Florida to do so. So this is kind of, for me, this is modern day. I'll just tick through a number of achievements that we realized in these 2 decades or so. Real quickly. So one of the things you see here is, of course, the North Jetty. In 2002, the district completed major renovations of the North Jetty with elevated concrete, cap, handrails, and that great system that you see out there today. Because of those renovations, we think in 2002, both jetties actually survived the 2004 hurricanes that devastated our area. We had no damage to really speak of. And you saw in the video that in 2004, the district hired the second administrator in the district's 100-year history, Marty Smithson, who would then go on to serve for 14 years with the district and the commission. But that happened, let's see, that was September, I think, of 2004, and then in November of 2004, an almost entirely new commission was elected. So new administrator, new commission, they started to wrap their head around the work of the district, and then in 2007 a number of projects came to fruition. We entered into that long-term coastal modeling agreement with FIT and Dr. Gary Zerillo that helps us manage those sand resources and sediment in the area. The district also installed the permanent pilings in the inlet's throat section. So this is known as the inlet throat section here before you get to the sand trap and then the channel, of course. This entire area is what we call the flood shoal, and this is the mouth of the inlet, and the ebb shoal north and south, of course. But we put permanent piling markers in the inlet's throat section to better define manatee slow speeds and better define the channel. In 2007, they also put the popular webcam and weather station up on the North Jetty. It features live feed images and videos, current weather conditions, tide charts, and more. If you don't know about it, you can go to our website, and there's a page that takes you directly to, links you directly to our webcam. One of the biggest things that happened in 2007 was they were finally able to move forward with a channel extension connecting the Sebastian Inlet to the Intracoastal Waterway. So that was a 3,100-foot channel, 9 feet deep, 15 feet wide as designed. I would tell you that the impacts of that project were both economic and environmental. Economic, obvious, local marine industry benefited from having a wider, deeper channel that larger boats could now go in and out of. And then from an environmental side, one of the things that the district did as part of this project was we repaired prop scars, we did public education around the importance of seagrass beds, not to mention just having a marked channel to get from the intercoastal to the inlet means boaters weren't coming every which way across those sensitive seagrass beds and chopping them all up. So this is what our Sebastian Inlet navigation guide looks like. We give them out free to anyone and everyone. They are waterproof, so they can be used on the water. We have them in our office. The Sebastian Inlet State Park Ranger stations give them out. They're at local bait and tackle shops, you name it. We also, for those of you that frequent the inlet, know that, I'm sorry? Oh no. For those of you that frequent the inlet, you also know that on that flood shoal, we also marked 6 zones of critically important seagrass habitat and put signs that say caution, shallow water, seagrass habitat out there, again, to direct boaters to stay away from those sensitive seagrass beds. In 2010-2011, the district built a 6-acre DMMA, is what they call it. What does it mean? It just means that it allows us to stockpile sand for emergency dune or beach repair. It can hold, actually there's about 50,000 cubic yards in there right now. But why is that important? Important because it allows us to mobilize resources almost immediately, and that became really important post-Hurricane Sandy and post-Hurricane Matthew, when we saw some pretty significant impacts to the dune lines south of the inlet. So we had that sand. We didn't have to wait for sand. We didn't have to dredge the sand, mobilize crews to come in and do that. We just had that stockpile sitting there waiting for us. So again, we were able to mobilize immediately and help folks. In 2011, we secured a total of $173,000 in cost share funding from FIND to complete 2 projects. The T-Dock construction. So the T-Dock was built on the south side to replace the old failing, what was once known as Henry's Dock. And then these are pictures from that project. And then we've got the Coconut Point stabilization. At that time, Coconut Point had lost more than 200 feet in 5 years due to wind-related erosion. And so you can see some of the things that they did to stabilize Coconut Point. You heard them talk about the economic benefits of Sebastian Inlet in 2003, and this is probably going to be updated in the next year or two. This does not include impacts on property values and essentially residential. So they estimated the total overall economic impact, including residential property values, was about $200 million a year back in 2013. In 2014, the sand trap was again expanded to 42 acres. Why is that important? Because it allows us to extend times between those periodic dredging projects. It's not easy to mobilize all those crews to do that. There's a cost to doing that, so if we can kind of maximize that, that's not a bad thing. And then most recently, of course, we just completed a project earlier this year that was a dredging project that placed 113,000 cubic yards of sand onto about a 1.5 mile stretch of beaches to the south of the inlet, starting at McClarty and kind of down through Ambersand is the area where we know we need to be placing our sand. And as part of that project, they also dredged not just the sand chap, but also the channel. In some spots, the channel is now as deep as minus 12 feet, which is a little deeper than those original specs of minus 9 feet. So that's not a bad thing. Stockpiled sand right now in the DMMA as part of that project. We've got about 50,000 cubic yards in the DMMA should we need to mobilize that for whatever reason to do some dune or beach repair. Really the last thing that I should leave you with is just that commitment to fulfilling our charter but doing it in an environmentally responsible way. You all know, we've talked about the habitats that are down near the inlet. There's so much down there that we monitor on an annual basis. We've got marine biologists that are going out to monitor the growth and health of those seagrass beds on the western flood shoal annually. We've got marine biologists monitoring the nearshore hard bottom reef. All of this reporting is available on our website, and we submit those reports to FDEP as well. as part of the recently completed bypass project, beach renourishment project. This entire 2019 nesting season, we've got ecological associates out there monitoring for changes in beach profile and escarpment to make sure that the project didn't have any negative impact on sea turtle nesting. So just something that's really important to us. And then final slide. We launched our year-long centennial celebration on May 23rd, 2019, to include an interactive social media campaign. We've got fun facts on Tuesdays, and we've got our historical archives being released as part of Throwback Thursdays. So we're kind of rolling out the timeline that you heard today on Facebook for others. And then we've got an environmental education lecture series coming up. It's going to kick off in November. It's going to be down at the Inlet the second Thursday of every month for 6 months. This presentation is November, but then we've brought in marine scientists and biologists from Harbor Branch, from Hub SeaWorld, to talk about some other important things. So I'll make sure to get Barbara that flyer to share with everybody in case you might be interested in hearing some of those guys talk. We've got a family-friendly community event that was planned for September that unfortunately got bumped, but I am pleased to report that we have rescheduled that event for May 2nd, 2020. So we will be closing out our 52 weeks of celebration with this big family-friendly event down at the Inlet, featuring 20 different informational booths and vendors from groups and associations. We've got surfing clinic and fishing clinics for kids. We've got environmental educational sessions on sea turtles and all the stuff that I talked about here today. Again, really the focus is on for kids. So mark your calendars for that. And then we will be releasing more of the archives that we have. It's still not a full accounting of all the historical archives that we cataloged, but in a coffee table book that's going to be released mid-November. So look for that. You can follow along on Facebook. You can go to our website. And again, I just want to say thank you very much for having us here and allowing us to share this stuff that nobody's ever seen before with you guys. We're just really excited to get it out there and hope people find it as interesting as we did when we were going through it. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month on November 9th. And it'll be a surprise.
Ask a question?
Oh, you don't have any questions? I'm sorry.
Yeah, all the early photographs show that they tried to build the inlet in the skinniest portion of the beach.
Yes.
All the later photographs showed it's the widest portion of the beach. Did they, in building the early inlets, build that beach wider in that area?
I don't think they did, but I can't be definitive on that. You're right that they tried to find the narrowest slice of land to dig through at the time, for sure. I think what you see, that change in topography, morphological changes to the inlet, is because of that sand that migrate. They didn't understand the migration of sand at the time. And we know that inlets, I mean, we're sucking in sand from the north without question, you know? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think a lot of that is sand, a lot of that was unanticipated, but please.
Yeah, that place, I spotted that too, and I think they might have made a mistake when they didn't have aerial photography back then, so they might have made a mistake putting the showing his cut where it was, because all that shoreline has stayed the same. That narrow spot is still there. It's below the inlet park, and it's where a bunch of houses are. But you can see, if you know the terrain, you can see where the inlet is today.
So this inlet is not in the same place as the early inlets, maybe?
I think they showed his cut just by mistake a little bit south of where it really was.
I wonder if they assumed because that's the narrowest part, oh yeah, that's where you must have had it.
Yeah.
And I think that it very well could have been the site, maybe a little further north of Gibson's Cut. We know that not necessarily Gibson's Cut turned into what Sebastian Inlet was. If that makes sense. But I hear you. You're talking about the 1880 to 81 map? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Gibson's Cut,
Yeah. I mean, that was 1880 to 81 hand drawn. Like, yeah. So they're not using GPS coordinates back then, right? So it could have been off a little bit. Yeah.
Are there any considerations being given to the rising water?
Can I ask a question if I 25 years ago, Zorrillo put in his wave measuring equipment.
Yeah.
Have you seen a mean sea level rise difference in that 25 years?
So I'm certain the answer to that is yes, but I cannot be specific about that. Let me get.
South of Port Canaveral.
I know they're doing
Either
Port
pipes-
Everglades, and I know. I'm sorry.
Either pipes or a cut or different. They're looking initially maybe to do some pipes for a 3 or 4 year experimental flushing to try to get the mosquito lagoon more nutrient diluted from the way it is now.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Oh gosh, no. So rising sea level is an issue. It is most certainly on Dr. Zorrillo's radar and on the Commission's radar. One of the things that there's an annual State of the Inlet report that we publish. It's about to be released. It looks at a lot of different things, including all of the things that help us manage sand within the system and understanding how sand is flowing naturally along our coast, how it's flowing in, how it's flowing back out. But it also, he looks at changes in shoreline. He does reporting on the impacts with and without sea level rise that is climate change driven. There's a seasonal component to sea level rise and change. And actually, this year's report, he's really excited about something that he's able to now conclusively say with the long-term data sets that we have. So he's been able to, and he tells me, I'm not the expert, but he tells me that they could not have come to these conclusions without having long-term data sets. But it's the seasonal impact, the impact of seasonal sea level change, separate and aside from any climate-driven sea level rise, has an impact on the amount of beaches along our coast, and it is largely influenced by the direction, the location, and the flow of the Gulf Stream along our coast. So it's not just unique to the Sebastian Inlet area. Actually, this trend that he's identified conclusively now in this year's report can be taken and applied along the entire east coast of Florida. So we're going to be releasing that soon. We share the State of the Inlet report with a lot of other people, including FDEP at the state level, so they can use that data to inform their decisions in terms of coastal resiliency planning.
I'm just kind of curious, is the Treasure Museum still open south of the inlet, and who is it run by?
So it is run by one of the greatest guys ever, Ranger Ed Perry, who unfortunately is going to be retiring soon. So if you haven't made it down to McLarty, go see him. He's been there for decades.
Is that a state museum?
It is. That museum actually belongs to the state park. It's part of that. It's part of Sebastian Inlet State Park.
Okay.
That's $2 she'll spend.
Yeah. And ask for Ed. Ask for Ed. He can tell you. He's been there over 30 years, and he can tell you just some stories. So
There are fascinating photographs down there. It's a wonderful museum.
It's a great
It's
museum.
so close. And bring a brochure to share when you go, so somebody else can be inspired.
yes,
You
sir.
mentioned the water quality apparently was declining in the 1800s. Is that man-made, agricultural, or whatever?
So we think so, and that was 1909 to 1914 is kind of the years that were bookmarked by Jim Culberson with some support that we reviewed. It looks like there was obviously agriculture, but also cattle farms over on the mainland, and that was contributing to it. So can I definitively say those were the only sources? No, I can't, but yeah, that's our understanding for sure. Yes?